Good afternoon, everyone. Today is February 1st. Happy February. Happy Black History Month. This is the briefing on local government's finances of the Ways and Means Committee. Last week, the Department of Legislative Services briefed us about the state's budget surplus. In today's briefing, the Department of Legislative Services will tell us how local government finances are doing. Many of the bills we will vote on this session will affect the bottom line of our counties and municipalities. This briefing will help us decide whether local governments can afford to provide tax relief and make new investments in public services. I look forward to an informative briefing, and with that, I will turn it over to Hiram Birch from the Department of Legislative Services and Valerie Monroe from the Department of Legislative Services. Thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon. We have prepared a presentation document. If we can kind of share that on the screen, I'll be started on page 1. And I think all of the members have had the document sent to them as well. Okay, if we turn to page 1, today's presentation will identify key findings and projections for local tax revenues. It will discuss the major sources of county revenues and the reliance on own source revenues and state aid, compare local budget projections in fiscal 2021 with actual revenue attainment with a focus on the local income tax. We will illustrate the record increases in local general fund balances and why they should continue to increase in fiscal 2022. We will also identify key factors driving local property and income taxes. The next page summarizes our key findings and projections from a review of local budgets and audit reports. Due to the fiscal uncertainty resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic, local governments took a more cautious approach in developing their revenue estimates in the past 2 fiscal years. Revenue projections for fiscal 21 adopted budgets were finalized at the onset of the global pandemic, when the full magnitude of the health crisis was relatively unknown. Since that time, several counties have revised their original fiscal 21 budget projections upward as the state's economy continued to perform better than what was originally anticipated at the start of the pandemic. Even with these revisions and the improved economic outlook, the adopted local budgets in many jurisdictions for both fiscal 21 and 22 continue to underestimate revenue collections for major local taxes. Actual local revenue attainment for fiscal 21 exceeded projections in several major tax categories, particularly the local income tax. Based on a review of audit reports for 14 counties, local income tax revenues in fiscal 21 increased by 11%. This contrasts to the 0.7% decrease that was forecasted in the adopted budgets. The largest overall increases occurred in Anne Arundel, Baltimore, Howard, and Montgomery counties. On a percentage basis, the highest overattainment occurred in Washington and Worcester counties. As a result, county governments realized record increases in their general fund balances at the end of fiscal 21. As fiscal 22 comes to a close, county governments should once again realize significant increases in their general fund balances as actual revenue collections from major taxes continue to outperform budgeted revenue projections. We will now walk you through the details of our findings and projections. And if you turn to page 3, it shows the primary sources of county revenues. State aid is the largest revenue source in 13 counties, and property tax is the largest revenue source in 11 counties. The local income tax is the 3rd largest revenue source for most counties, but in 4 counties, the income tax is the 2nd largest revenue source after property taxes. Page 4 shows the reliance on local own source revenues and state aid for each jurisdiction. Own source revenues include locally generated revenues such as property taxes, income taxes, and service charges. Local taxes account for the largest share of own source revenues. Many of the state's less affluent jurisdictions receive a lower percentage of their funding from local sources and a higher percentage from the state and federal government. As you can see from the map at the bottom of the page, the reliance on state aid ranges from around 16% in Worcester County to over 50% in Caroline, Somerset, and Wicomico counties. We will now focus on county budget projections for FY21 and 22, which is shown on page 5. Now, this page provides a snapshot of what the local revenue projections were in the last 2 years based on their adopted budgets. As you can see at the bottom of the page, local governments projected that local taxes would increase by around 1.4% over the 2-year period, and that general fund revenues would increase by 1.3%. Their major revenue source, property taxes, was increasing at a modest rate of around 2.6%. But if you look at income taxes, local governments' FY21 budgets were based on a 0.9% decrease in income taxes and a 2.1% increase for the current fiscal year. Page 6 shows how the local revenue projections were constrained by the COVID-19 pandemic. Here you can see that property taxes continue to increase slightly each year. That's based on the county assessable base, which is based on assessment projections, which we will talk about later in the presentation. When you look at income taxes, they basically remained flat in all 3 years, with recordation and transfer taxes decreasing. But if you turn to page 7, and this provides a comparison of the state income tax in relation to the local income tax based on improved economic conditions in the last 2 years. And a lot of that is due to the federal stimulus payments that were provided to both the state and local governments. The state income tax collections actually increased at a significant rate in FY21. It increased by 9.4%, which is a $1 billion increase. And as you can see at the bottom of the page, the local governments were projecting a 0.9% decrease. Based on the current BRE revenue forecast, the state is also projecting a 3% increase in local revenues, in state income tax revenues in 22, and a 7.1% increase in 23. If we turn to page 8, it shows the actual local revenue attainment in FY21 for the 14 counties that have submitted their audit reports to DLS. We are still in the process of collecting the other 10 audit reports. But you can see here that based on these jurisdictions, the local governments projected a $4.7 billion collection in local income tax revenues, but they actually collected $5.2 billion, which was 11.8% increase over their projections, which represents around $500 million. If you turn to page 9, it provides a more complete picture as it actually compares the 2020 collections in local income tax revenues with the amounts collected in 2021. Here you can see that local income tax revenues for these jurisdictions increased by 11% compared to the amount collected in 2020. And this mirrors the increase at the state level. So you can see here that the projections at the state level also kind of trends with what's happening at the local level as well. So what does all of this mean? Well, if you turn to page 10, the overattainment in local tax revenues have led to record increases in local general fund balances. County governments ended fiscal 2021 with unrestricted general fund balances, including rainy day funds, totaling $4.3 billion. This represents a $1.1 billion increase, or 33% higher than their balances in the prior year. Page 11 shows the local fund balance as a percent of general fund revenues on a county by county basis. Here, the ratio averages around 24% across county government. Talbot County on the Eastern Shore had the highest unrestricted fund balance amount at 55% of their general fund revenues. They were followed by their neighbors, Somerset and Wicomico counties, that also had fund balance amounts at slightly below 50% of their general fund revenues. In contrast, Dorchester County, Baltimore City, and Montgomery County had fund balance amounts that were below 20% of their general fund revenues. And page 12 shows the increase in local fund balance since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. You can see that in 7 jurisdictions, the increase has been above 40%. All the jurisdictions had an increase except Baltimore City, which actually decreased. So I will now turn the presentation over to Valerie, who's going to discuss the main factors driving local revenues.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Hiram. Good afternoon to the committee members. So if you turn to page 13 shows the factors driving local revenues, which are primarily the property and income taxes from the various jurisdictions. And these two taxes account for around 90% of local tax revenues. With local property and income tax rates remaining relatively stable in most years, the primary driver for increased local tax revenues in annual growth in the property and local income tax base. The property tax base is comprised of the county assessable base, which includes both real and personal property. Due to the triennial assessment process and the homestead assessment caps, the property tax has remained a relatively stable and predictable revenue source for county government. County property tax revenues have increased at an average annual rate of 4% between fiscal 2016 and 2020. With property assessments forecasted to remain positive in the near term, local governments should continue to realize considerable growth in this major revenue source. When it comes to income tax, the local income tax collections tend to mirror the annual growth in state income tax revenues. Based on the current Board of Revenue estimates revenue forecast, state income tax revenues are projected to increase by 3% in fiscal 2022 and by 7.1% in fiscal 2023. Assuming the growth in local income tax revenues continue to track the overall growth in state collections, local income tax revenues should also continue to increase in the near term. Can you turn to page 14? So on this page, we'll take a deeper dive into the factors driving property taxes. And this is primarily the county's per capita assessable base and the county property tax rates. The larger the property tax base in a county, the more revenue that can be derived with an increase in the local property tax rate. If you take a look at the first chart, you would observe that Allegheny, Wycomico, and Somerset, they reported the lowest per capita assessable base, while Worcester and Talbot counties, they reported the highest property tax base, per capita assessable base, sorry. In the second chart, you would observe that 7 counties decreased property tax rates in fiscal 2022: Anne Arundel, Calvert, Cecil, Hartford, Kent, Montgomery, and Wycomico. Talbot County was the only jurisdiction to increase property tax rates for fiscal 2022. We'll now turn to page 15. On this page, you would observe that the county assessable base growth remains modest over the 10-year period. Based on this graph, the State Department of Assessment and Taxation projections, the local property tax base will increase by 3.1% in fiscal 2022 and by 2.9% in fiscal 2023. This tracks the overall annual growth rate over the past 6 years. The chart, the map below shows the county assessable base growth for fiscal 2022. In fiscal 2022, the annual increase in property assessment ranges from 1.6% in Allegheny County to over 5% in Frederick and Prince George's counties. Most counties will realize annual growth in the range of 2.5% to 3.5%. On page 16, this slide shows the property reassessment, which was released in January 2022. On the first map, property reassessments averaged 12% statewide, with reassessments exceeding 15% in 6 counties. Charles County realized the highest increase at 23.4%, or 7.8% on an annualized basis. Property reassessments, as you would observe from the map again, were below 10% in 6 jurisdictions, with Kent County realizing the lowest increase at 4.5% or 1.5% on an annualized basis. The map below shows the county property assessment caps for fiscal 2022. Growth in property assessment may be limited by the Homestead Property Tax Credit Program, which provides a cap on annual assessment increases. State assessment cap is set at 10%. Local governments can, however, set the assessment cap between 0 and 10%. Most county governments have set assessment caps below 10%. In Talbot County, the cap is actually set at 0%. Can you turn to slide number 17? We'll now take a closer look at the factors driving income tax within the jurisdiction. And this is the net tax, the per capita net taxable income and local income tax rates. The first map shows the net taxable income from Montgomery and Howard County. They're the ones that led the state in per capita net taxable income, followed by Talbot and Anne Arundel counties. Somerset County had the lowest per capita net taxable income, followed by Allegheny, Dorchester, and Wycomico counties. The map below shows the local income tax rates for calendar year 2022. County governments are generally authorized to set a local income tax rate of between 1% and 3.2%. 11 jurisdictions currently impose the maximum rate, with 5 located in the Washington-Baltimore corridor and 6 located on the Eastern Shore. 2 counties decreased local income tax rates in calendar year 2022, and this is St. Mary's and Washington. And on slide 18, this slide shows the net taxable income growth and how it varies across the state. So in 2020, the net taxable increase, as you would see on the first map, had a slight increase of 0.2% statewide. And the second map shows the net taxable income growth over a 5-year period starting tax year 2015 to 2020. On a statewide basis, the net taxable income increased by 3.7% over the 5-year period. I want to thank you again for taking the time out to listen to our presentation, and I will now hand it back over to Hiram.
Okay. We have also included in your package under the data tables a series of exhibits that provide information on property, local tax rates, and local revenue amounts. It's from our County Revenue Outlook report. And so it basically will show you the tax rates for FY21 and FY22, the projected revenue amounts for FY22 that's based on their county budgets, and we put it on a per capita revenue amount so you can see how it varies across the state. So this concludes our presentation. We're open to any questions that you may have.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the committee members? Delegate Ebersole.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Back earlier in your presentation, Mr. Birch, you had a chart that had income tax rates as increases, this may be a question that demonstrates some of my lack of knowledge, but I only see about 14 jurisdictions on those charts. They're on page, I'm looking for them right now, sorry. Page 8 and page 9.
Correct.
Are these only the jurisdictions that realized increases in local income tax collections? Is that what that is?
No, these are only the 14 jurisdictions that we have received audit reports for.
I see.
We are still in the process of collecting the audit reports for the other 10 jurisdictions.
Okay.
So
we just don't have, so that information is just not available for the other 10.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Delegate Palakovich Carr.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to the DLS staff for the presentation. I actually just was reading in an article from NCSL, National Conference of State Legislators, about kind of how states and local governments have fared through the pandemic, and they were saying that in general, a rule of thumb has been, at least at the national level, that states tended to see a much quicker and harder hit in terms of revenue decreases, but local governments, for the most part, tended to not see that immediate impact. I think what you just presented kind of upheld that rule of thumb, but I wonder, what your take is on that specific to Maryland.
Right. One thing about Maryland is we're one of the few states that allow local governments to impose a local income tax. In most jurisdictions, local governments rely on the property tax and in many cases, the sales tax to fund services. So in Maryland, by providing local governments with the income tax, that major revenue source kind of trails what the state collections are. However, one of the main revenue sources in Maryland is the property tax, and do both the triennial assessment process where we do reassessments every 3 years and the homestead cap program that kind of holds down assessment growth to a certain limit. That provides a cushion for our main revenue source during an economic downturn, because the assessable base kind of grows kind of the overall impact is cushioned, big increases, and also cushions you from a big decrease. So we have certain things built in Maryland that kind of protects local governments from wild swings in local conditions.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions from the committee? Delegate Lasanti.
I was having a hard time unmuting. Just a quick question. In reviewing this, I mean, we're recording over $500 million of unanticipated, undesignated revenue in local government. That's a lot of money. That's quite a windfall. Do we have any idea what, where this money is going to be spent? I mean, is this a new cash money that's just basically at the whim of each of these 150, all these local governments, or is there investment occurring to solve problems that we know exist? And if you could speak to that at all.
Right. Well, just as the state government has additional revenue that's going to be decided on how to spend, the local governments will decide how to deal with this. Some of this money may show up in their upcoming budget for FY23, which they're working on right now. Some of that could be utilized for the upcoming fiscal year. Some of it may be held back for future expenses.
Right.
We do know that the current and the blueprint has been implemented, and the local governments will be required to, many local governments may be required to spend more money funding local public school system. This could be a use for that, but this will be determined by the elected governing bodies in each jurisdictions.
Certainly. I just think there's just such a tremendous once in a multi-generation opportunity to do wide-scale investment with this type of additional funds. And I hope that we work with local government in the state, that everybody just doesn't spend their piece on some little wish list, that we actually drill down and spend these funds wisely to accomplish long-term goals. Thanks.
Delegate Patterson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you very much for the report. I have a question regarding the property reassessments as noted on page 16. Can you give some guidance on why property reassessments were higher in some counties? And I'm particularly interested in my own county, Charles County. Do you have any sense of what happened there or why that reassessment is higher?
Right. We'll need to reach out to the State Department of Assessments and Taxation. This data was just released at the beginning of January, so a lot of people are still just looking into the numbers. So we will reach out to them to kind of find out what's driving the differences among the 24 jurisdictions, and we will report that back to the committee.
Thank you very much.
Okay, seeing none, that concludes the local fiscal briefing for the Ways and Means Committee. And everybody has about 4 minutes to hop off of this link and join the other Zoom link for our hearings this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Goodbye.